Hi, Cindy. Welcome to the Underflow.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me on our maiden voyage of the Underflow podcast. Just to give you and everybody else a little bit of information about the Underflow. Underflow Records is a label and collective that my friends and I started in Detroit in 2018, and I've wanted to do a podcast element of it for a long time. So again, thank you for agreeing to be the first podcast on the Underflow. This episode, we were talking about calling it the magic of music and movement.
Okay.
So we can get a little more into who you are and who I am and what the Underflow is and what you're doing and what we're talking about as we go. But my name is Adam Fitzgerald, and you are
Magik.
And this is the Underflow. Let's get started. So, the magic of music and movement. What does that mean to you?
I believe that everything in life is movement on some level. And I think that life doesn't exist without movement. But I think that in modern societies, there's a lot of stagnation. And I think bringing movement back into our lives or just joining together in community and movement with music is where magic happens or where a lot of healing happens. So that's what.
Cool. I would agree. I think that is the magic of music and movement. Very healing. So I would like to talk more about what you're studying because you're also in graduate school right now, correct?
Yeah.
And you're studying DMT, but it's not dimethyltryptamine.
I think it's dance movement therapy.
Okay. So dance movement therapy is tied to what you're always telling me about, somatics. And I would love it if you could break down dance movement therapy, somatics, where it all comes from. Please educate us about this breaking field of psychology.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of buzz around somatics in media nowadays. There's a lot of different applications, but it's really an ancient form of healing. Ancient cultures have always used some form of communal gathering around music and movement to celebrate different rites of passage or just different events in the community, different cycles. So it's really something that's really inherent to all humans.
Right.
And more something that we've unlearned through modern society, and the comforts or discomforts of modern society and this severance between our bodies and minds. So, somatics from a psychological lens is basically the reconnection of the body and the mind and tapping back into the knowledge that the body holds and the potential that it holds for healing. And dance movement therapy is like a branch off of like the somatic field, and it is like rooted in modern dance. Like I said, it's really ancient and really old and has always been around, but it kind of had this revival after the Second World War, where a lot of veterans all over the world were really suffering from like the first time that PTSD was recognized, or beginning to like shell shock was being like talked about. So when a lot of young soldiers came back to the US, there was like this meeting of young psychologists that had learned under Freud and Jung in Europe, and then had come over to the US because they were maybe, like kind of on like a leading edge of psychology, and we're trying to intertwine it with the arts, which was like maybe then getting them like expelled or have reason for them to leave their like home countries in Europe. And then they began to work in like a lot of these wards where a lot of soldiers were housed, and also with like a lot of schizophrenic patients that maybe that was like a like aftermath of the wars, and just trying to join with the patients in like a nonverbal form, and they used dance to do so. So a traditional dance movement therapy is always kind of set up in the same way, where like the group gets together in a circle, and the circle is like really important and elemental to these ancient forms of gathering too. And then the therapist usually like leads some sort of journey for the group. And this is how it was traditionally practiced from the pioneers of dance movement therapy, and elements of that still exist and are still used by therapists today.
Okay. So this is a relatively new field then. Right. I mean, to give a little more context, Cindy and I met through working together for an international SVOD, streaming video on demand company that will remain nameless for now. But Cindy was running the German publishing department, and I was running the English publishing department. And we've been talking about a lot of these concepts for a few years now. We met almost 3 years ago now. And you shared with me the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I can't remember the author's name because I can't even pronounce his name, but he's a doctor from Europe.
Yeah, it's Bessel van der Kolk. I believe he's Dutch.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm not finished with the book yet. I'm about halfway through, but it's a mind-blowing, revelation, considering that a lot of what you're talking about is really new. And, you were talking a little bit about schizophrenia and how that was diagnosed in veterans. And it's crazy to me that we didn't even have the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, until relatively recently, a few decades ago. I mean, there was shell shock. But other than that, there was a lot of these diagnoses of schizophrenia, which was resulting in sometimes brilliant men being lobotomized, right? So just the advent of post-traumatic stress disorder and those therapies, and then the other branches that you're studying, such as dance movement therapy and somatics, it's new and revelatory and really healing. And it's a common theme. I think it will be a common theme throughout the entire Underflow podcast, but this episode as well, the rebellious nature of sometimes naturally healing things. Like you were talking about, there are these ancient practices that are as simple as getting in a circle and dancing or moving, but it moves something within us, and it can be really healing. So that's only been studied the last few decades, and there's been different schools of thought in that you're kind of breaking down now.
Yeah, and I think like it's really important to name that it's always been around, and it's just kind of being reinvented or like brought back to our knowledge.
Well, it's like being like labeled, right? And it's like being named.
Right.
And I always think of the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, and it says, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. So it's like we're just naming this ancient practice, which has been around forever in all these different cultures.
Right. Yeah, and we were talking a little bit earlier about how there's always this need to make things like scientifically proven, and until now, somatics and dance movement therapy still falls into like the creative arts therapy realm. So like not with like the hard evidence behind it, but I study like neuroscience and like understand how this all connects. But I just like hate that there always has to be like the scientific evidence behind everything, because we just know that it works. Like, we were just talking about how going to like a dance event is so healing for people, and it only takes like a good DJ and a fun accepting, like open crowd to reignite people and just like make them feel something, because like what there's so much out there nowadays that just is trying to numb us and like disconnect our bodies from our mind. And I think that's so much more important. But for funding and like for how the world just works and how our society works, everything always has to have some sort of evidence behind it, so we can bill for insurance, so we can like put it in the DSM, and so we have a diagnosis. So like that's where like it's really difficult for me to like be like within the system.
You don't want to necessarily commit to the confines of anything, especially when, like you said, most scientific evidence is just for funding, so it all has a monetary value, so people have to stick within certain schools of thought and certain systems established by different universities or different societies, so they can even get the funding to do the research they want to do, when in reality what you're talking about is experiential evidence, and the proof is in the pudding. The proof should be in the pudding. If people feel better after dancing or spending time moving or making love with their partner or just going for a jog outside or exercising or doing yoga, whatever it is, I think we know through all sorts of science, moving the body releases endorphins. It can help with serotonin levels. It can help us sleep, everything like that. So again, tying back to the more ancient sides of things, we have the evidence in so many ways. So having to quantify it does feel a little silly or almost reductive sometimes. And what you were speaking of, community events, is obviously huge for Underflow and what I've done. And all about Whatever Fest, which takes place in Detroit, and that's a community event that I've been working on for over a decade, and it's trying to really bring people together for the exact reasons you're talking about, so people can share memories and movement and music and art and heal that way through connection as well as movement and community. Because I think these things are really foundational, like you said. Like, we can call it whatever you want. You can try to quantify it with science, but I think ultimately what you're studying is a better, more modern way to connect people to these teachings and educate them and heal them. So I really commend you for doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's cool.
And we were discussing also before we got on the airwaves, how in these community events, when people like just have fun with each other and dance, we kind of come back to like what we're naturally meant to do, and there's always like just like cathartic release. And that's like what some of the pioneers of psychology were looking for, is like figuring out, like kind of what like lures in our psyche and like finding ways to release that in healthy ways. And I would say dancing is one of the healthy ways. It's good for your body. It's like good for community, and so much of what the Body Keeps the Score talks about is about how traumatic events get stored in the body. And the like short explanation of it is that when we experience some sort of traumatic event in our lives, but we don't have the ability to react to it how we would, I guess, how our ancient selves would react to a threat, and fighting it off or running away. So none of our muscles get activated in the way they want to activate, but the same hormones are still flooding our body as if we wanted to fight. So a good example is when we're say in a business meeting and our boss yells at us and we want to defend ourselves, or we want to do something, but we're conditioned to stay in the meeting, maybe just like take whatever
Sure.
that person that is like hierarchically above us is like saying to us. So even something like that could cause something in our body to not sequence fully. So say like you're my boss and you're yelling at me and I want to punch you, but I don't punch you because I depend on myself
Right.
to be
Sure.
family.
Sure.
Right? So even like that defense mechanism
Right.
is like not fully sequenced. So then maybe like my arm starts to hurt, after a few days because it's like that movement, that reaction, that defense mechanism that wanted to happen couldn't happen.
Right. Okay. Yeah, we were talking about that idea of things being stored in the body and the idea of things sequencing or not sequencing, which is really interesting because that's like literal and metaphorical, right? Because we have synapses that fire, the neurons that fire through the synapses in our brain. So it always makes me think of that too. It's like we have these misfires that happen socially, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And what you're talking about is physically and chemically. And I think that's really interesting because we're also learning through science that these types of traumas can be passed down, like you were saying, genealogically. And that's why we have these kind of like ancient defense mechanisms of whether it's hierarchical or, Carl Jung talked about the archetypes a little bit, in terms of, maybe the reason we have nightmares about certain animals or deadly snakes or deadly spiders is because it's ingrained throughout, human evolution that we were taught to be afraid of these things in order to survive. So it's like they come out of the darkness at us. These are the archetypes. And I think what you're exploring is kind of related to that in a way because you can kind of literally and metaphorically shake these things loose by dancing and through movement or by connecting with other people and kind of having these different experiences, which obviously both of us have experienced ourselves too. So again, it goes back to this idea of trying to quantify something that it's hard to have a blind study or anything because some people don't necessarily enjoy loud music or dancing. So it might be better for different people to move their bodies in different ways. But you can have these kind of magical experiences and, like you said, release, which that's a theme and a goal of a lot of psychology, right? Releasing and healing.
Right. Like bringing things to the surface and processing them. Yeah. And what you were saying reminded me of like that image of like a prey running away from the predator and then like, even in life, in modern life, when we like achieve something, when we like, overcome something, like we don't even take the time to like shake it off, right? We just like we have to like move on to the next task. And like that shaking off is so essential. And that's why I think in coming to either together in a communal setting, or like you said, if someone is maybe, had bad experiences in communities and is just not ready to go there yet, to in some way find ways to move through the body. And also, like remembering, not to take like an ableist approach, like some bodies can only move in certain ways, and that's also really important. There's a lot of somatic techniques. There's like another branch called body psychotherapy that focuses maybe, you could say, more on like subtle movements like breath work. Breath can also be triggering to some people. There's like so many nuances, but I think there's like something for everyone.
Yeah, I like that idea that there is something for everybody. I think that's really central to what we're trying to do with Underflow and the Underflow, is that there is something for everyone and a better world is possible. And I know we talk a lot about kind of lofty goals and systemic issues and the big ideals of humanity, whether it's peace or equality or diversity, inclusivity, these things that I think you're working towards really, really well. You're working really hard in terms of what you're studying so you can actually help people. And I know you've said often that you don't really see yourself working in a, stereotypical therapist, counselor, psychologist role, as beneficial as that is and as necessary as that is for most people. You're studying a different field, which could relate to the healing of individuals and groups through movement and dance. And I think that's really where our worlds come together, and how we connected, even working for a corporate international streaming service. We immediately connected with these ideals of wanting to help people, and I think that's really noble for you. And I'm not sure if it's absolutely idiotic what I'm trying to do with Underflow. Everybody who gets involved with the label or our collective always asks me, how do I do it, and isn't it a lot of work? And yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Whatever Fest is a lot of work. Underflow is a lot of work. Getting a master's degree is a lot of work. But so is surviving nowadays. And I think it's really great that you're helping people and you're bringing these new topics to light, because I guess, as you said, they're not new topics. It's really a different lenses, and it's new lenses. And you've talked to me before about having to kind of jump through the hoops. We've talked about jumping through academic hoops. And as much as we love academia, and as much as this podcast, I hope, is going to be dedicated to education in all forms, it's really hard to, as you said, kind of buy into the system or be forced into the system, or to quantify, the science behind the magic. And we're not even as woo-woo spiritual as a lot of people we know necessarily. But I think it's really important to have that open-mindedness and open-heartedness, as we've talked about before. So I think it's really, really cool that, there are these newer avenues for people, even if it's, constrained by certain levels or realms of academia. I've told you about this. I don't think you've ever seen this movie, because I've asked you. SLC Punk, Salt Lake City Punk. And it's all about punks in Salt Lake City, and it's really interesting. And I don't want to give too much away, but one line, because one of the guys ends up going to law school, and he says he can do more damage to the system from within the system, instead of from outside the system. And so it's like, I know that you have a rebellious streak, and it was rebellious to, name PTSD or DMT at the time. So now it's kind of a new era is dawning, and you're a part of that. And I want to believe that people are more open to healing now, or, willing to look within or be more introspective. I think it's really important to promote that type of introspection. So thank you for helping me with this. At least we're attempting. So,
Yeah.
we had a bunch of topics that we wrote down in our notes here. Anything specific that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I wanted to touch and just tie together a couple of things that you mentioned, a couple of things that we wanted to talk about, because I think that, what lies at the core of this is like a social justice aspect, because, you can look at it through like a woo lens, you can look at it through like a psychology lens, but at the end of the day, I think we know that our world is not just and not working right now. So I think what I'm doing and what you're doing with Underflow Records is that it's just an open platform for artists from all different backgrounds to come together. And it just shows the openness to diversity, which I think is the most important aspect of everything that anyone should be doing is active in any way nowadays, because everything that is wrong in our society is because we're so divided on all levels, whether it's like international conflicts or personal conflicts, like the example we were giving with like even in a small corporation, like the way we are enslaved in like our 9 to 5 and not. So I think anything that we can do to shake people up and show them different avenues to free themselves from the corrupt systems that we're a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I think that's really vital. And I think we are living in a time of sea change. I think we are honestly on the cusp of at least American Revolution, if not worldwide revolution. I mean, I've told you about my friend, maybe she should remain unnamed, but she's a professor at the Hague in Amsterdam. She's been sending me videos of protests there. There's been protests in Denver and Detroit, where we spend a lot of time, and also in LA, where we have a lot of friends. Pretty much everywhere. It's happening right now. It does feel like almost like the end of capitalism or the end of an era. Maybe a revolution is afoot. We can only hope, because the reality is there's the murder of a lot of people happening right now. We can't use the G word because I think, we would be censored. And who knows, we might run into that with this podcast. It's very possible that there will be censorship issues because we are huge fighters for the First Amendment. We talk about the freedom of speech all the time, and I try not to get on my soapbox too often, but it happens, as all of my friends and family know, and I think decently too. My grandfather, Jim Fitzgerald, wrote for the Detroit Free Press, and although he didn't talk about his experiences in World War II much or his experiences in the Civil Rights Movement, he did take on the KKK and some crooked politicians in Michigan through the power of the written word when journalism really meant something. I have my whole family really is involved in journalism, and I've been working on a book series forever. So the Underflow podcast, I hope we can really empower everybody from academics to artists and musicians and dancers, everybody in between. The arts really have no limits. And like you said, there's really no limit for the arts to heal either. So I think we can educate, we can liberate. I think the more people learn of history, the more we can really diversify our knowledge and our paths forward, because again, a better world is possible. I think the more people start working together instead of working against each other, cooperating instead of competing, I think we could absolutely change the world. Because the fact is, the 1%, as they're called, I don't like using the word elites because they're absolutely the worst of humanity. They're the ruling class, as Aaron Bushnell called them. This is what the ruling class has decided will be normal. And we have to fight back against that. It's time to rise and resist and revolt. And some of the best ways to do that is through connectivity, community, education. And I think we're at a point where people are so hungry for change. Change is so necessary. Inflation is so bad. I mean, people cannot only not afford to go to university in America, they can't afford rent. They can't afford their mortgages. They can't afford groceries. There's no mass transit. There's no health care. There's really no hope for the future, as Tupac Amaru Shakur once wisely said. They got money for wars. They can't feed the poor. They say there ain't no hope for the youth. But the truth is there ain't no hope for the future. And, he also has another line that the power is with the people that the politics oppress. And we talk about that a lot, that people have more power than we are given and we are allowed. And with systemic oppression, as bad as it is right now, the world being built on blood, as it were, I think people are becoming more enlightened to the way things are. And as much as that's hurting people and requiring healing of therapy, counseling, too many people relying on psychiatry and big pharma, more people could be relying on community and music and arts and movement as healing. agents. And I think these things go hand in hand. When people are oppressed and they're desperate, not only do they start rising and revolting against the oppressive powers, but they start connecting and they start helping each other to heal. And I think that's a huge part of our work and what we're trying to do in every level of society, whether it's in academia or in psychology or with the books I'm writing or with Underflow Records or with whatever fest or with anything that we're trying to accomplish. I think it's really important. I think we have a little bit of time left. And I did want to give a little bit of extra context. I grew up outside of Flint, Michigan, and spent most of my life in Detroit before I moved to Edinburgh, Scotland, and then moved west. But you grew up in Germany. And so it's really, I think, vital for a German American, an Irish American, to be talking about these things because, as we're all told, history is written by the victors. And so much of what we're taught is different, yet the same. And so much of the capitalist mindset that rules this world is the monetization of labor and time, and it reduces people to numbers. And I think it's really interesting how, say, the American Revolution is taught over and over again. I know I've worked as a teacher throughout the American public school system. So the American Revolution is focused on more than any other revolution or historical event. Whereas something like World War II is dealt with how in Germany?
I think similar to the revolution, it's just taught over and over again. And, out of the traditional historical lens, which, I'm not saying that's not how it went, but I'm just saying that there's so much more to history that should be taught as well. And it's important that some history doesn't repeat itself, I think, for sure. But like you were saying, I think by focusing education like very narrowly on certain topics, a lot can be missed. And I think by also, not specifically focusing on other ideologies or just like letting young people form their own opinions, but being pigeonholed like in the societies that we grew up in, like a very capitalistic mindset, or there's Germany is more of a social democracy, which just means you pay even more taxes and get more out of it, which makes you maybe stay stuck in the system even more because it is actually more reliable.
If it works.
But we were just talking about some more like communist concepts and like how like maybe some Marxist concepts could evolve to a society where money isn't like the center of everything.
Absolutely. Because so many people just freak out when they hear these terms, communism or socialism. And it's ironic because capitalism is way closer to fascism than either of those. And most communist or socialist, parties or countries or values have kind of either destroyed themselves or been systematically destroyed by coups or by America or the U.S. or the UN. We've talked a lot about how the United Nations and NATO, these forces have kind of, we talk about history being written by the victors. Like you said, it's not like we're questioning that Hitler had to be shut down and the Axis had to be shut down. The use of nuclear weapons is always questionable, but at that time, there was so much happening when information was so much more limited. Let alone going back to the time of Marx in the mid 1800s when information was, so limited and hard to get to people only in pamphlet and printed form. Now we are live streaming these horrors coming out of the Middle East, and really whether it's in Gaza or the child slave labor in Congo or these horrible things happening in Sudan, and we now know the history of everything that's happened in South America and Africa and the Middle East and these different places, the history of oppression. And again, so many people kind of freak out at these ideas of communism, but what Karl Marx was writing about and talking about and what he was fighting against was very real and very intelligent. And so, as you were saying, some of these ideas could be reshaped, and none of these isms have exactly worked out. And I'm a big fan of Terence McKenna, and he often talked about how ideologies do us no good, essentially. And I've always thought that myself. I really feel like ideologies only divide us. And again, coming back to the state of the world, we know that the majority of the wealth and the resources and the tools and the weapons and military power and all of this is all hoarded by the 1%. It's like the best analogy is that, the majority of the pie, everything there is hoarded by the 1%, while the rest of us kill each other for crumbs. And that is all made possible through manipulation. And that propaganda has taken different forms throughout different ages. And it's interesting to see these different isms take each other out: communism, socialism, capitalism, these different eras of, say, McCarthyism, when people were being really hunted down for their values during different eras of the Cold War. And we're not really sure if that's ever stopped, because now we know the mainstream media is fully supporting Israel, and we're getting these fake stories about beheaded babies, from that it was all Hamas's fault, and, Israel is the victim. And then it turns out those stories were made up and actually spread further by corporate media, whether it's CNN or New York Times or Fox or what have you. And they're covering, let's say the Trump trial, or, whatever the Clintons are up to, when we know those people are evil and they don't care about the American public, and they've been to Epstein Island, and most of the ruling class, as Aaron Bushnell called them, are horrible people, pedophiles, warmongers, insider trading, political puppets, manipulating Congress and manipulating people's values. It used to be religious differences, religious ideologies people were killing each other for, and now it's political ideologies. I guess it's still religious ideologies in some places, but I think all of the things we are talking about totally sidesteps everything like that, because you could bring all these different people from different religions, different backgrounds, different cultures, different creeds, different countries, and bring them to an event like Whatever Fest. And there's different styles of music, there's different styles of art, there's people from different places. That's why I love places like Detroit, because you really feel the diversity. You feel that people are on equal grounds, and we were talking about places like Berlin, and even a place like I lived, like Edinburgh, having that diversity, I at least feel a sense of relief, because it feels like the real world to me. And I think we can really heal through the magic of music and movement. So I'm not sure how much time we have left, but thank you so much for coming on the first podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Cindy Key, Somatic Movements, Dance Movement Therapy, thank you for being on the Underflow. This has just been our first episode. Hopefully it's been enjoyable, entertaining, and educating. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much, Cindy. Peace on earth to everybody. Free Palestine. Long live the working class and the oppressed peoples of the world. Let's end debt slavery and end exploitation. Peace and love.
Peace and love.